According to my research, Ukraine is not democracy after Maidan because Maidan was undemocratic. Overthrow of Ukrainian government, it was violent and unconstitutional overthrow of Ukrainian government. Even though it was supported by Western democracies, this again and was misrepresented by the media politicians. This was not democratic. So this means actually Ukraine become not an independent country. It became a client state, heavily dependent on the West after the Maidan. Even so, again, media did not report this with a few exceptions. All the evidence shows that these snipers who were located in Maidan control buildings like Music Conservatory, Hotel Ukraina, and many other buildings on Maidan and close to Maidan area were actually who shot and killed policemen and also Maidan activists. These were Maidan opposition snipers.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're joined by Professor Ivan Katchanovski, a Ukrainian and Canadian scholar who is specializing in politics and conflicts in Ukraine. Professor Katchanovski spent 11 years researching one of the most pivotal events in the modern history of Ukraine, the Maidan Massacre. Professor Katchanovski's latest book titled The Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, The Mass Killing That Changed the World, illustrates the origins of the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the decisive role played in it by foreign actors. It is available in open access. Our viewers can find the link in the video description below. It is a wonderful book. I read it and I learned so much from it. Thank you so much for joining today, Professor. It is such a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's great to have you. So, Professor, your research is truly incredible. Understanding what happened during the Maidan and knowing the key actors is absolutely a must for those who really want to understand what is going on in Ukraine today. I know you went through hours and hours of Maidan protest videos and recordings, and you're very familiar with the place, of course, where the events unfolded, where everything took place. The Maidan massacre was truly a tragic and pivotal event. At the time when this was happening, Ukraine had a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, and his political party of the regions, was very popular, of course. Ukraine had an active and functioning political opposition at the time, and Yanukovych wasn't against Ukraine seeking membership in the EU. His position was that Ukraine just needed a bit more time to address specific domestic economic challenges prior to signing the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was at the core of the protests. But despite this, civil unrest and protests began in late 2013, and then they turned violent in early 2014, eventually turning into what we now know as the Maidan Massacre. What was the goal of these protests if Yanukovych did not reject the idea of the EU Association Agreement to begin with?
I think the initial goal of the protest in Ukraine was called Euromaidan, and it was protest against decision by Yanukovych to suspend signing of association and free trade agreement with the European Union because Yanukovych motivated this by a negative economic effect on Ukraine from a free trade agreement, which would make, again, Ukrainian industries, which were heavily dependent on trade with Russia, again, suffer because of new agreement and also restrictions on Ukrainian exports and tariffs from the European Union if Ukraine was to sign such agreement. And he learned this again very late, and he decided to suspend this agreement. So initial protest was called Euromaidan. It was as a protest against the decision by Yanukovych to suspend such agreement. But the protest movement changed very significantly after initial protests, which were not significant in terms of, or were not, how to say, very large in terms of our participation. This was, again, just few days of mass protests taking place, but the number of people who participated were just in thousands or tens of thousands, 10,000s, which were not, or dozens of thousands, which were not very large if you take into account population of Ukraine and also size of Kiev, with many millions of people living in the capital of Ukraine. But this changed very radically on November 30th, 2013, when the remaining protesters on Maidan, on the Independence Square. Just about a few hundred protesters remained on this Maidan Square, and they wanted to leave basically because this protest was dissipating, and about at 8 at 4 a.m. in the morning, these protesters who remained on the Maidan were actually violently dispersed by the Berkut police. And this dispersal was televised in live and also was very heavily publicized by Ukrainian media, specifically by television channels, including the one which was owned by head of presidential administration of Yanukovych. And this dispersal, which was very violent, was shown on Ukrainian television as evidence, or it was presented as basically a kind of beating of young children, basically, or not the children, but young kind of Ukrainians, teenagers and students in particular, by the police without any need to do this. And this actually led to mass protests afterwards. Next day, there were a few 100,000 people demonstrating in Kiev, and they were demonstrating against Yanukovych and violence by the police, which they saw on the television, basically, and which was very heavily promoted by the media as such a kind of to start such protest, mass protest against Yanukovych. But the media actually played a very kind of, how to say, typical role in this conflict in the Maidan, because they did not show that this dispersal of Maidan protesters by the police on November 30th was not just unprovoked, that this was actually specific. There were clashes between protesters who actually who were then members of the far right sector, and they were clashing with police, throwing at them like heavy objects and so on, and this led to police basically beating violently other protesters who were remaining on Maidan. But these were not student protesters. This actually, according to the data which were released, most of the people who were injured during the dispersal by the police were actually older ones, and just a few of them were students. And many of these activists were actually who were protesting were from Western Ukraine, which is also my native region in Western Ukraine. But media basically misrepresented this, and they omitted specifically, they deliberately omitted involvement of far right, right sector, and also that violence between right sector and the police, which led to such dispersal. And according to testimonies and other evidence, this actually dispersal was ordered not by Yanukovych, which was which was again narrative which was promoted by the media and by Maidan opposition, but this was actually decision or kind of order which was given by actually very likely by head of his administration, who actually was one of oligarchs and then resigned after this. So this is, I think, very important kind of mass protest which was taking place initially as supporting Euromaidan, kind of European Union integration, and many people actually believed wrongly that this agreement between the European Union and Ukraine would mean that Ukraine would become a member of European Union, which was not actually the case, because this agreement specifically rejected any possibility of recognizing Ukraine even as potential member of the European Union. So, but this again was never mentioned by the media, and Maidan opposition used kind of misrepresented this kind of agreement as basically as a way for Ukraine to join European Union. So many actually people believe that they would enjoy very kind of rapid improvement in their lifestyle, in their quality of life, in their income, and would live basically as Germans or like other people and other kind of members of European Union after they would after this agreement would be signed. But this was not the case. So this kind of protest, which was initially kind of motivated by European Union agreement and later was motivated by violence, which was misrepresented again specifically for political purposes.
Official reports that I could find online discuss that the protesters were, there were young people, there were students, and of course, those who supported integration with Europe, as you just mentioned. If you look at the protest movement during that time, sort of as a whole, would you say that the people who were doing this, who were participating in the protest and in the civil unrest, did they actually represent the Ukrainian people as a whole? Did the majority of the Ukrainian population support the Maidan protest at that time?
I think this is also a very important issue, kind of which I examine in my forthcoming book, which will be published about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins, going back to the Maidan, to Euromaidan. And I have an entire chapter on the Euromaidan, including mass protests, which I just discussed, violence, the role of far-right, another chapter, and also chapters about Maidan massacre, but also examine public attitudes towards Maidan. And according to public opinion polls, at the time of Maidan protests, there was a split between in Ukraine. About half of Ukrainians, or close to half of Ukrainians, supported Euromaidan, and almost half of Ukrainians opposed Euromaidan. So there was basically a split in Ukraine between supporters and opponents of Euromaidan. And this split was not just kind of even in Ukraine. Absolute majority of people in Western Ukraine supported Euromaidan, and many of them actually were very active in participation in mass protests in Kiev. So a lot of protesters in Kiev actually were from Western Ukraine, specifically from Galicia region of Western Ukraine, which is traditionally anti-Russian region and also kind of a pro-Western, but also pro-nationalist region. And many people from this region also at the time were have their relatives or themselves were working in European Union countries, specifically in Poland and other countries like Italy. So they were heavily supporting Euromaidan, and people in central Ukraine, including Kiev, capital of Ukraine, were also majority of them supported Euromaidan, but to a lesser extent than Western Ukraine. But in contrast to these two regions, people in eastern Ukraine, including like region of Donbass, for instance, and Kharkiv, and also people in southern Ukraine, including Crimea at the time, and other regions in southern Ukraine also opposed Euromaidan. So majority of them were in opposition to Euromaidan, and a number of participants from eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine in Euromaidan protests was much smaller compared to Western Ukrainians.
In February of 2014, more than 100 Ukrainian civilians were murdered by sniper fire in the very center of Ukraine's capital, Kiev, on the Maidan Square. And of course, in Ukrainian, Maidan, the word Maidan means a city square. So the Maidan Square is basically the very center, the very heart of Kiev. Needless to say, the Maidan massacre shook the population of Ukraine to the bone, because this was an unprecedented act of violence in the modern history of Ukraine. At the time, nothing like that ever happened. Could you give us an overview of how the Maidan massacre unfolded based on the findings of your research in your book?
Yes, I examined this massacre very closely and using a comprehensive analysis of all publicly available evidence. So I look into, I think, thousands of hours of footage, including live streams from Maidan, also recordings from about Maidan massacre, from and television reports and social media reports about Maidan massacre from in different languages, in addition to Ukrainian, but also other languages like Russian language, Polish language, and German, and so on, and examine Maidan massacre trial, which was again for about almost 1,000 hours of Maidan trial broadcasts on YouTube, which were about Maidan massacre trial, again Maidan massacre trial investigations and also findings and evidence, and also examine testimonies of eyewitnesses about Maidan massacre, and hundreds of eyewitnesses. And I visited Maidan, Independence Square, and neighboring areas in which this massacre took place in 2014, shortly after this massacre happened. And I'm very familiar with this area. So I studied in Kiev when I was a student. It's the beginning of 1990s, and I visited Independence Square almost each year since, until again and right after Maidan massacre took place. So for me, this is, I think, a very comprehensive analysis of all evidence which I presented in my Maidan massacre book, which is open access, which you mentioned, and also in now 4 peer-reviewed journal articles, which are peer-reviewed and published, also kind of and also open access, so anybody can, if they're interested, anybody can read these articles and my book. But I can summarize this evidence. Most important day of this massacre started on February 20th, but actual massacre started on February 18th, when several dozen Maidan protesters and about 1 dozen of policemen were killed during clashes between Maidan activists and police. And this massacre culminated in the massacre of almost 50 Maidan activists and 4 Maidan policemen on February 20th. And this was the most important part of Maidan massacre because it was televised, it was shown to not only to Ukrainians but to entire world. I was watching this live when it happened, and as I mentioned, I examined this very closely. So on February 20th, this massacre started with shooting of the police, Berkut police and internal troops on Maidan Square, Independence Square, by snipers who were located in the Music Conservatory and neighboring buildings which are controlled by Maidan opposition. And afterwards, because of the shooting, there were 3 policemen killed, and many, I think a few dozen of them were injured or wounded by gunfire by Maidan snipers. And this even footage of one group of snipers who were filmed by CNN going from Music Conservatory and going to just in front of Maidan stage on Maidan Square, and with weapons, with Kalashnikov and with hunting weapons, and then shooting of police start from just in front of these cameras, in front of CNN. But CNN never released this footage. I requested this footage from a library and archive from CNN, and they gave me this footage for my research purposes. So again, this is just one example. You have videos basically showing protesters who were armed with weapons and starting then shooting police, and at the same time when policemen were killed and wounded on the Maidan. And this was done in front of many other hundreds of eyewitnesses. It was done in front of Maidan stage, Maidan politicians. This was also done in front of many journalists, Ukrainian Western journalists, but nobody reported this. Even so, you have now a film on CNN, again, footage from CNN, which I included in my video appendix. So anybody can see actually the construction of Maidan massacre in my video appendix, which is contains video segments from dozens and dozens of sources and reports. So basically, there was also footage and videos and photographs of Maidan snipers shooting from Music Conservatory, and this was reported by BBC. These pictures, and they were shown by BBC as well. And this was also reported by eyewitnesses from police and from Maidan activists that snipers were shooting police from Music Conservatory. And at the time when policemen were killed and wounded, and this is not only they were not only shooting into police, because at the same time Maidan activists were also shot and wounded. And at the time, according to investigation, police did not have any live ammunition. So they did not have rifles with weapons with live ammunition. They did not have Kalashnikovs. They were armed with rubber bullets, basically. And so they could not shoot in the back or shoot back into snipers, but the snipers were shooting into both policemen and Maidan activists. And according to government investigation, 10 Maidan protesters were wounded at the same time when policemen were killed and wounded on the Maidan. And there are like videos and there are like testimonies and investigation results as well that shooting was from Hotel Ukraina into Maidan activists and also from Music Conservatory. Again, at this time when these buildings were controlled by Maidan opposition. And after this shooting of the police, policemen received order, and after many of them were wounded and 3 of them were killed, they started to retreat at a very fast pace from the Maidan, because they were not able to respond to this shooting by snipers from Maidan control locations. So they fled basically Maidan and moved to areas on Institutska Street and Hreschytyk areas, and Hreschytyk, and Hrushevsky Street in a very rapid escape. So basically, they were running away from Maidan because they were shot. And this is like police, thousands of members of the police basically were running away because they could not shoot in kind of in response to shooting from Maidan snipers. And afterwards, when Maidan protesters started to pursue retreating and fleeing Maidan police members from the Maidan, and they were also shot by snipers. So during this retreat, snipers started shooting and killing Maidan activists, and the snipers were located in Hotel Ukraina and other buildings which were located near Maidan and also on the Maidan Square. This included music conservatory. This also included Zhitnevy Palace building and Kozatsky hotel, also main post office building, and other locations like Bank Arkada and buildings on the left and right side of the Institute Street. So this means that there were many snipers who were shooting into Maidan activists during the retreat by the police. And at the same time, one unit of police, Berkut Police, called Special Berkut Police Company, moved in towards Maidan, and they were shooting from Kalashnikovs. So this was filmed by all the media, and this was presented basically as police shooting all these Maidan activists. Because they had the Kalashnikovs, they were shooting with Kalashnikovs, and this was shown as basically as police basically trying to storm Maidan and kind of kill Maidan activists. But all this media basically they omitted all this what happened before. So all this kind of shooting into police by Maidan activists was omitted, and they presented basically this unit about 2,000 Berkut policemen as the ones who were snipers, and they also claim that government snipers were shooting Maidan activists. And they claim that snipers were located into buildings which are controlled by government forces like cabinet ministers and so on. But actually, evidence shows, which was also confirmed by Ukrainian trial and investigation, and which I examined myself in my study, shows that actually 4 Maidan activists were killed before even this unit appeared. So they were killed by hunting ammunition at the time when there was no kind of unit with Kalashnikovs even appearing there. So this means, again, they were killed by somebody else at the very time when snipers were shooting both protesters and police, specifically, and the snipers were Maidan snipers, and they had hunting weapons. So again, this is and even Maidan massacre trial decision stated that this 4 policemen, 4 Maidan activists were killed not by this unit because it was not physically possible, because they were not even deployed. And this footage of this, and after this. Again, and this members of this unit of Berkut police were charged with the Maidan massacre. They were charged by Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine with the massacre of almost 50 Maidan activists. Even so, as I mentioned, 4 of them were killed before even this unit appeared. And also very important, because when they were shooting into with Kalashnikovs, at this very time when they were shooting, when police were shooting, protesters were not killed and wounded. So this is, I think, very important, because if I synchronize all the footage, video footage, and it's possible to see when the police was shooting from Kalashnikovs, you can see that Maidan activists are not killed and wounded, they do not fall, basically. But they were killed and wounded at the time when police was not shooting with Kalashnikov. So there were other gunshots, many gunshots with different sound. And this meant that, again, there were another group of snipers who were shooting into Maidan activists, not this not the police. And according to Maidan massacre trial verdict, and also to my studies which I published, which are now corroborated and confirmed by Maidan massacre trial verdict, this unit of police did not have any order to massacre Maidan activists. This unit basically was deployed to help to retrieve a group of internal troops who were staying in Zhevnevy Palace building during the evacuation or retreat by the police from Maidan area. So they after a few minutes they basically retreated from the Maidan area after they evacuated this group of internal troops. So they did not have any order to massacre Maidan activists, and they did not shoot into to kill Maidan activists. Even so, it's not possible to exclude that they might have accidentally shot kind of via ricochet some Maidan activists, but this is again requires forensic examinations. And this is also consistent with forensic medical examinations, which shows that absolute majority of Maidan activists were shot and killed from very steep directions, which did not coincide with directions of location of the police on the ground, on the similar level or the same level on the ground, because Maidan activists were shot from very top positions, very steep positions, which would match buildings like Hotel Ukraina, which was controlled by Maidan opposition, but also other buildings which are located in this area, like Bank Arkada and Horodetsky Street buildings, and also Zhevnevy Palace. October Palace building on the Maidan Square. So this is basically kind of most important part of this massacre, and there is also footage which shows that there were Maidan snipers who were based in Hotel Ukraina. They were shooting from Hotel Ukraina, and this hotel was guarded by Maidan opposition at the time of Maidan massacre. And there is no evidence of any government snipers located in these areas. But then, when this police retreated to barricade, and there was also shooting into police. You can see footage, video footage, that police were also under fire from Maidan snipers located in Hotel Ukraina, and they were shooting back into snipers who were located in the Hotel Ukraina and Zhevnevy Palace. And again, this shooting by the police was presented as a police, basically Berkut police shooting Maidan activists, because at this very time, during this massacre, during this shooting by the police, Maidan activists were killed. But again, the specific time of the shooting and direction of the shooting by the police did not coincide with specific times and direction from which Maidan activists were killed. And because at the same time, there are snipers who were also shooting Maidan activists, and they were shooting Maidan activists in the back from the Hotel Ukraina and from the side from Bank Arkada, from Zhevnevy Palace, and also from Horodetsky Street and Muzeyny Lane Street. So this is massacre basically continued until appearance of government snipers. And about 10:30 in the morning, again, after retreat of the police, which started shortly before 9 a.m., there was a unit of government snipers appeared on Institutska Street, and this unit was also filmed by Ukrainian journalists, and this unit was misrepresented as a death squad because they had sniper rifles. They aimed their sniper rifles in the direction of Maidan, and they were shooting. So this was shown on Ukrainian television and other Western media as evidence that this unit was responsible for the massacre of Maidan activists. But I synchronized all the footage and other and even Ukrainian kind of group also synchronized such footage independently, and this footage and also government investigations show that this unit of government snipers appeared at the time when massacre was almost over. After this appearance of this unit of government snipers, the shooting of Maidan activists basically stopped. With one exception, one activist was killed, but he was killed again from the direction of Hotel Ukraina, not from the direction of government forces. So and there were three other protesters who were killed. They were killed in the Maidan area when there was no police present there. There was no fighting there. So again, but it was very close to Hotel Ukraina and other locations. So this is just basically what happened, and almost immediately Maidan opposition and media blame basically Berkut police and government snipers for this massacre. Even so, evidence shows that they were not the ones who massacred Maidan activists, but they were also massacred by Maidan snipers.
Of course, the narrative promoted by the Ukrainian and Western governments shows that Berkut, or state anti-riot forces, shot at people on the Maidan based on the order that they received from former president Viktor Yanukovych. And this is exactly what you described was the official narrative. And then your research shows quite different story. And so you prove otherwise. Yanukovych did not order the killings. So who were the snipers? Who did they act on behalf of? Is it possible to answer this question based on your research, who they acted on behalf of?
Yeah, I think this is very important observation and kind of a question because again, media, Ukrainian Western media and Maidan opposition immediately and Western governments immediately blame Yanukovych for this massacre. They said basically that he gave orders, or his ministers basically or commanders gave orders to massacre Maidan activists and were responsible for this massacre. And even Biden called Yanukovych right after the Maidan massacre and told Yanukovych to basically to leave not only Ukraine but also his presidency. And he said this is basically because he was responsible for Maidan massacre without any investigation. And according to my examination of all evidence, there was not a single evidence of any order given by Yanukovych, by his ministers of internal affairs or security service of Ukraine, or even police commanders. There was not a single evidence, not a single testimony, single admission by anybody. Again, there was no evidence whatsoever, no written document, no kind of any recording on radio intercepts of Berkut and internal troops, which I examined as well. So again, not evidence, no evidence at all. And even Maidan massacre trial verdict, which was issued almost 1.5 years ago, specifically stated the same, that there is no evidence whatsoever presented by prosecution or examined by the trial which shows that Yanukovych gave any order, or that Minister of his Internal Affairs gave any order to massacre Maidan activists. And the same applies to even to commanders of Berkut. So there was no evidence of any order whatsoever to massacre Maidan activists by Yanukovych and his ministers and his commanders. And this is, I think, very important because this is, again, narrative which is still promoted and many people do not know this. They just take this at face value because simply because Maidan activists were killed, and this automatically they assume this was a responsibility of another side of this conflict, which was basically Berkut police and government snipers. Even so, as I mentioned, there was no such evidence that they were responsible. And instead of this, all the evidence shows that these snipers who were located in Maidan control buildings like Music Conservatory, Hotel Ukraina, and many other buildings on Maidan and close to Maidan area were actually who shot and killed policemen and also Maidan activists. These were Maidan opposition snipers. And so this evidence includes testimonies which I mentioned about again, like several hundred witness testimonies about snipers located in these buildings, which were confirmed by Maidan opposition at the time of this massacre. They also include testimonies of absolute majority of wounded Maidan activists. So absolute majority of wounded Maidan activists testified for the Maidan massacre trial investigation that they were shot by snipers located in Hotel Ukraina and other Maidan control locations, or that they witnessed snipers in these locations. Again, these people who were there, they were wounded themselves, and they testified that not Berkut police in front of them, which kind of on the ground, but the snipers in these buildings shot them, or they shot other Maidan activists, or they saw the snipers in these locations. And so this is, again, evidence which kind of shows this is one set of evidence. Another set of evidence, videos. There are about 15 videos of snipers in these buildings, which I examined. So in this video show, which I mentioned, videos by BBC, by CNN, by French television, by Polish television, by many other kind of Ukrainian television, Russian television, and German television. Also, in particular, German public television, and all these videos show that this activists in the Hotel Ukraina and the Music Conservatory were snipers from Maidan opposition. And you can even recognize them by by a head of this group of snipers, who was again later elected as a member of Ukrainian parliament. He was from Western Ukraine, and this sniper spoke in Ukrainian language with Galician dialect from Western Ukraine. but they were so basically they were Ukrainian snipers. They had weapons which were look like Kalashnikov weapons, but they could have been hunting versions of Kalashnikov, and they were also armed with hunting rifles. So this is one group of snipers, which again, and many of them admitted publicly in Ukrainian media interviews and also Western media interviews after the Maidan massacre that they shot police from Music Conservatory and from Maidan area. But so I think four of them admitted shooting shooting police during this Maidan massacre. But in addition to this, there were also testimonies by admissions by several Georgian snipers who stated in media interviews which they gave to Israeli media, to Italian media, television, to Macedonian media, to and also they testified to Russian media, and also they testified for Maidan massacre trial investigation. And one of their testimonies was shown at this trial. They stated that also they received orders from Maidan leaders, Maidan opposition leaders, to shoot both police and Maidan activists, and they testified that they saw other snipers, including snipers from this group, which I mentioned, of Ukrainian group of snipers. And so this is again, we have admissions of many snipers, and but not a single admission from government snipers or from Berkut that they shot again police or they shot Maidan activists. So this is, I think, very important evidence. And in addition to this, this kind of evidence, which includes videos and admissions, not only videos of Hotel Lukina and Music Conservatory being controlled by Maidan opposition, you see people like you see members of the parliament basically standing guard of Hotel Lukina entrance at the entrance during this Maidan massacre. There is also evidence that snipers were shooting from this is BBC footage, which shows snipers shooting from 11th floor of Hotel Lukina. And this floor, this actually room of Hotel Lukina was occupied by leaders of Svoboda, far-right Svoboda party at the time of this Maidan massacre, according to government investigation. And also, again, there are kind of videos which shows, again, that I mentioned that there were some snipers which were captured by Maidan opposition, and they disappeared after the Maidan massacre without any trace. And there are videos which show that, and testimonies of Maidan activists which show that these snipers were actually evacuated by leaders of Maidan opposition. So this means, again, there was no reason for Maidan opposition to hide or kind of release any snipers if they were from Yanukovych kind of forces or from like even Russian forces, because but there was a very kind of rational way to do this if they were Maidan snipers, Maidan opposition snipers, which is also evidence of what happened to the snipers who were captured by Maidan opposition. In addition to this, there are like statements by Svoboda, who said that they took control of Hotel Lukina before Maidan massacre, and they guarded this hotel during the Maidan massacre. And another evidence, I call this dogs that do not bark, in Sherlock Holmes kind of type of evidence, is kind of rational choice evidence that that government investigation denied that there were any snipers located in these buildings. So even so, you have all such evidence. They denied basically that there were any snipers in Hotel Lukina. They denied there were snipers in any Gaza locations, even after kind of all these testimonies by absolute majority of Maidan activists, forensic examinations, and other evidence. So this is kind of another proof that the snipers were not from any kind of Yanukovych forces or from Russia or any other force, but they were members of the Maidan opposition. And so this is consistent with all the evidence which I examined. And I can also say that even forensic examinations which were conducted proved that many activists were shot from Hotel Lukina and other Maidan control locations, and for this reason investigation stopped. These experiments by ballistic experts, they did not do this even after Maidan massacre trial requested that they conducted such examinations. So ballistic experts showed that many Maidan activists were shot from Hotel Lukina, but after Maidan massacre trial ordered them to do this for all Maidan activists who were shot and killed, prosecution refused to basically to do this. So this is kind of another evidence that they did this to protect and kind of and hide the involvement of Maidan opposition snipers in this Maidan massacre. So this is all the evidence, and I can also say that even ballistic forensic examination of bullets, which was conducted, which was from Berkut, entire regiment of Berkut, found that these bullets did not match bullets from which Maidan protesters were killed and wounded. And so, and this examination was kind of was also not revealed by the media, but it was revealed at the Maidan massacre trial, and I said this in my book and in my studies. So all the evidence shows this were basically Maidan opposition snipers from different units. This was not just one person or just few people acting on their own. This was part of a specific massacre which was organized very kind of complex massacre, because you have many snipers in different locations, and also they acted according to coordination. There is even audio recording of one group of snipers shooting, again on order which they received from a phone call. So they were communicating and they were shooting from different locations on, again, and you can see this this audio recording of this group of snipers. But again, this was never investigated. This group of snipers was never investigated, and they were not government snipers, because you can hear like government audio recordings of government snipers, which were also released and misrepresented as shooting Maidan activists, but they actually were deployed much later. They were from Alpha unit of security forces of Ukraine, and I can say that order, basically, according to testimonies by Georgian opposition members, was given by members of Maidan opposition leadership to shoot both Maidan activists and Maidan protesters. But in addition to this, I also cite in my studies a book, and interviews in my book, which was published by two pro-Maidan journalists, Ukrainian journalists, in which they interviewed a member of Maidan of Far-Right Svoboda Party, leader of Far-Right Svoboda Party, Svoboda, Freedom, called Svoboda in Ukrainian, and he is a deputy who was deputy head of Ukrainian parliament. And they said in these interviews, separate interviews, they said that few weeks before the Maidan massacre, they met with representative from the West, from Western governments or from the West. They do not name this person, but they said that they met with this person and other members of Maidan leadership, and they had discussion basically. That after first few activists were killed at the end of January, they had discussion with this Western representative how many people need to be killed basically for Western countries to stop recognizing Yanukovych. And they said, they asked Western representatives, like 4 people is enough? They said, no, 4 people is not enough. Like they said, like 10 is not enough, 20 will not be enough. So they said, we agreed that if 100 people will be killed, this would be enough for Western governments to kind of stop recognizing Yanukovych. And this is exactly what happened. Immediately after Maidan massacre on February 20th, Maidan opposition declared Maidan activists who were killed. They call this heavily handed. So they specifically use number of 100 as very important. Even the number of killed Maidan activists was less than 100. So they included people who were killed not even on Maidan, people who died from like medical conditions, from heart attacks, people who were even killed in some in Lviv area. One committed suicide and so on, but they died from medical issues. Even after Maidan, they were included in this heavily handed, specifically kind of to bring number of Maidan activists who were killed to 100, because this was very important. And as I mentioned, afterwards, Western governments immediately recognized new Maidan government, and Yanukovych, they blame Yanukovych for this Maidan massacre. Even so, there was no evidence whatsoever to say that Yanukovych was responsible, and all evidence was clear that Maidan opposition was involved in this massacre. And as I mentioned, Biden called Yanukovych and told him right after the Maidan massacre to not only to kind of leave Kiev, but also to leave presidency and to leave Ukraine. So this is also kind of evidence that this was done with Western government support and de facto support. And it's not possible, I think, that Western governments would not know actually what was going on, because all the publicly available evidence which was very clear even at the time when this massacre took place.
Thank you for walking us through the details. It's very, very valuable and absolutely tragic to hear about this. During the Maidan protests, I think all of us saw videos and photos of Victoria Nuland handing out cookies to protesters and John McCain giving interviews in front of the Maidan, from what I can recall, effectively discussing a coup d'etat, an overthrow of the democratically elected president Viktor Yanukovych at that time. You alluded to foreign actors being involved in these events, but could we maybe discuss in greater detail what role did the West and perhaps other foreign actors play in the Maidan, in planning the events, in carrying them out, and also in handling post-Maidan Ukraine?
I think this is also a very important issue, which I also examined in an article, peer-reviewed journal article, which was published just a few weeks ago in Econ Journal Watch magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Again, which is one of the popular journals in, not a magazine, it was in journal, peer-reviewed journal, academic journal, which examined the role of the West in the Maidan, and again in overthrow of Yanukovych government. And I can say, based on the evidence, I already mentioned this testimony or interviews by Svoboda leaders about Western representative who told Maidan opposition leaders that it would be necessary to have 100 Maidan activists killed, basically for West to stop recognizing Yanukovych, and this is exactly what happened. And this is again not just accident. But again, this is at least this will be a how to say, I call this like moral hazard, basically creating incentive for Maidan opposition to create to force basically Yanukovych to kill Maidan activists, to try to provoke this killing of Maidan activists, or this was incentive for Maidan opposition basically to create false flag massacre, which actually what happened based on my research. And in addition to this, like Victoria Nuland famously her famous visit on Maidan, giving the cookies, and I think she said it was not cookies but sandwiches. I think it in Ukrainian this may be a closer to the truth, but I think most important actually is that she was also involved in this overthrow of Ukrainian government, and this recording of her conversation with U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, in which they discuss composition of Ukrainian government, new Ukrainian government. But this recording actually was released a few days, no, a few weeks also before Maidan massacre, and in this recording they talk about that Yatsenyuk, leader of Fatherland Party, needs to be Prime Minister of Ukraine, and members of other Maidan opposition leadership need to be again either included or excluded from the government. But they talk at this time about coalition government, which was offered by Yanukovych. At that time, Yanukovych offered Maidan opposition to join his government, and he suggested that Yatsenyuk might be Prime Minister of Ukraine. But again, but this is not just a isolated issue, because this was basically Western representatives discussing a composition of the government, who would become who would occupy each position. And this happened after Maidan massacre. New government was elected, and Yatsenyuk became Prime Minister of Ukraine. Again, and this was discussed by Victoria Nuland even before the Maidan massacre. But also there was testimony of Foreign Minister of Ukraine at the time of Maidan, Leonid Kozhara, I think his name, and he said this at Maidan massacre trial, that during a visit to Ukraine in December of 2013, right after start of Maidan protest, Nuland met with Yanukovych, and he was present at this meeting. And she said to Yanukovych basically that Yanukovych needs to basically to form coalition government, and he has to basically fire a government of Mykola Azarov, who represented Party of Regions. And this is actually what happened. Yanukovych fired Azarov government, I think at the end of January or start of February of 2014, before the Maidan massacre, and this was one of the demands of Nuland. So this is, I think, also very closely related to what Nuland basically tried to replace Ukrainian government during the Maidan with a new government, which would be kind of which would be more pro-Western government, or would be a kind of a client state of the United States. And this is what happened after Maidan. Kind of you have a new government, and there's a lot of evidence that Western officials like Nuland and other government officials like Biden were actively involved in the composition of the new government, in the selection of new government officials, including prime ministers, if you can, like Yatsenyuk. So this is not accidental. So this is, I think, there's clear evidence of involvement of Western governments in overthrow of Yanukovych. But in addition to this, there is also interview by Barack Obama, who said in interview to CNN, I think in 2015, that United States played very active role in kind of in facilitating a transition in Ukraine after Yanukovych, after the Maidan massacre. So he basically admitted that the United States government was involved in a kind of overthrow of Yanukovych. He did not specify what kind of nature of this, but it was clear that there was involvement of U.S. government, and it was admitted by Obama himself. But there is no specific evidence of any involvement of any Western snipers or again of Western involvement in the Maidan massacre. As the same concerns Russian involvement in the Maidan massacre, there is no evidence of such Russian involvement in the Maidan massacre. This was also confirmed not only by my academic studies, but also by by Maidan massacre trial verdict, which was issued in Ukraine.
Professor, did Europe have any role in the Maidan events?
I think again a very important issue. Because I rely only on public sources, so I rely on public examinations of evidence, and there was presence of kind of politicians from the European Union, like Polish, like Kaczynski, for instance, Lech Kaczynski, one of the leaders of Poland, was on the Maidan, kind of cheating and supporting Maidan opposition, similar to John McCain from the United States, and like senator, another senator from the United States, and many other Western politicians publicly supported Maidan protests by participating in this protest, just going to Maidan massacre, going to Maidan Square before the Maidan massacre, and they supported personally Maidan opposition at this time. So there was kind of public involvement, public support for Maidan opposition, and also European Union immediately recognized a new Maidan government after the Maidan massacre, and they do not kind of demand any investigation of Maidan massacre. So actually, even so, this was supposed to be investigated according to agreement, which was signed by Yanukovych and was signed by leaders of foreign ministers of Poland, France, and Germany. This agreement basically stated that Maidan massacre would be investigated by within the moment of European Council or Council of Europe. This did not happen. There was no such investigation. There was one report by Council of Europe Commission, but they just said basically that there were snipers in Hotel Ukraina, but they just basically relied on government investigation. They did not conduct their own investigation, and Western countries, European Union, stay silent about Maidan massacre, and they basically supported this violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government by means of Maidan massacre. So this is just such a situation, and again, you have also kind of suggestions that there were also kind of presence of some snipers, group of snipers from Baltic states, from Poland. This was stated by Georgian snipers, but again, I do not find any confirmation of this in public sources, so I cannot say this definitely if this was such a moment.
One of the sort of interesting points about the events of February of 2014 that I find quite unusual is the fact that Yanukovych actually agreed to sign the agreement with the opposition to resolve the conflict. I think this was in early February, the 12th, if I'm not mistaken. And so he agreed to restructure the Ukrainian parliament, from what I understand, to give more voices to the opposition amid the protests, as the protests were ongoing. And the same day when he signed the agreement, he fled Ukraine. He fled Ukraine the same night that he signed that agreement with the opposition. the question that I've had for probably 10 years now, why didn't the opposition accept his signing the agreement since he effectively agreed to meet some of their demands? Why wasn't that enough to stop the violence?
I think this is also a very important issue, and I mentioned already this agreement, which was signed by Maidan opposition, Yanukovych, and also by leaders of foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland. This agreement, in addition to investigation of Maidan massacre, they also called for early elections and basically formation of government unit, government of national unity afterwards, and this would meant basically that Yanukovych would face possibility of being defeated in elections because he was blamed for violence during Maidan by the media, by politicians, and so on. But this would be this would be politically kind of democratic way to resolve this conflict. But what happened afterwards actually was very different because Maidan opposition did not accept this agreement. They violated this agreement almost immediately, and one group kind of activists went to Maidan stage and they called for overthrow of Yanukovych. If Yanukovych would not leave his position as president of Ukraine, they said that they're going to use weapons against him. And this was not just kind of just empty statement. This was stated by leader of one of the group of Maidan snipers, which I mentioned in my study. So this was kind of a very real threat against Yanukovych. And also, in addition to this, there was also evidence which I cited in my studies, which also revealed by Maidan massacre trial, but also a trial of treason of Yanukovych in Ukraine. So there was evidence that Yanukovych was also target of assassination attempts. Right after Maidan massacre, he was supposed to be assassinated near Kiev. There was a shooting into his motorcade, and his bodyguard was almost injured, but car was hit with bullets, and bullets entered, even hit one of the bodyguards, but they hit in his handgun. So basically, bullet was stopped by handgun of one of bodyguards of Yanukovych, and his car was hit and so on. And later, Yanukovych, that's why Yanukovych fled from Kiev. He after Maidan massacre, because he knew that he could be assassinated and there was no way to protect him in Kiev. So he moved to Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, and then he was also subjected to assassination attempts, again, according to testimonies of eyewitnesses. He could have been assassinated in a Congress in Kharkiv, so he did not participate in this Congress. And so he tried to move then to fly in helicopter to Donetsk, another city in eastern Ukraine. But according to testimony of helicopter pilots who flew Yanukovych and other eyewitnesses, they said that they received order from new Maidan leadership to Ukrainian leadership after Yanukovych fled Kiev. They told they said that this order said that his helicopter would be shot down by Ukrainian military jets if Yanukovych would not be basically if helicopter pilots would not would not stop flying Yanukovych and would basically give him up to Maidan opposition. And so this is why he fled Ukraine with Russian help. He later returned to Crimea, but afterwards you have start of new conflict. But also, I think very important that after Yanukovych, shortly after Yanukovych fled Kiev, all Maidan opposition took control of all government buildings. Basically, they seized presidential administration building, parliament. So they took all these buildings under control. And afterwards, the parliament of Ukraine voted to basically to remove Yanukovych as president of Ukraine after Yanukovych fled to Kharkiv. Basically, they said that he abandoned Ukraine and he abandoned his responsibilities as president of Ukraine, and that he was basically responsible for Maidan massacre. Even so, this was not the case. So this was false claim, and the vote to remove Yanukovych was conducted in illegally. There was no such kind of clause in constitution of Ukraine to kind of remove sitting president under such claims, under such conditions, without any procedure for impeachment, which was not followed, and even number of deputies who voted for kind of for removal of Yanukovych was not sufficient kind of number according to Ukrainian constitution, and also evidence shows that this vote was fabricated because many and was conducted under duress because many deputies, specifically from Party of Regions and the Communist Party of Ukraine, which supported Yanukovych before Maidan massacre, they actually voted under pressure from and under threats from Maidan opposition, including by threats from this group of Maidan snipers whom I mentioned, because they admitted publicly that in media interview in Ukraine that they threatened basically these deputies with violence if they would not vote to remove Yanukovych. So this is, and also what this number of people who voted to remove Yanukovych was much smaller than number of deputies who voted to remove Yanukovych was much smaller than was stated in media reports, because actually at the start of a parliament session, which wanted to remove Yanukovych, only about slightly more than half of deputies registered in the parliament, and a number of, even so there were other deputies brought by force to the parliament. There were many other deputies who were not present in the parliament, but their names were recorded as voting for impeachment or removal of Yanukovych, even so they were not present. There are no photos, no videos of them in the parliament, and you can just count. I counted number of deputies in different videos during the vote to remove Yanukovych, and the number was about 260, which was short of a number which was, I think, over 300, which was later reported, basically. And one of leaders of Maidan opposition stated later that he basically was responsible for getting duplicates of electronic cards from members of Ukrainian parliament, from the secretariat of Ukrainian parliament to vote for this deputy. So they basically what was falsified by Maidan opposition, leaders specifically to remove Yanukovych, because they voted with like not with no, this was not real people who voted to remove Yanukovych, but many of them were actually from kind of just their electronic cards which were removed from the parliament secretariat by Maidan opposition, specifically to create such votes. So this is just all the evidence is cited in my studies and examined in my studies, but again, this is never reported by the media or misreported and misrepresented by the media and by politicians.
Very interesting. Many people here in the West read the official narratives in the mainstream media, and they see Ukraine as they see post-Maidan Ukraine, I should say, as a democracy, as this land of, almost like freedom, and they see Zelensky as the leader, as a democratic leader. But in a post-Maidan Ukraine, what role did foreign actors and foreign countries, Western countries, play in Ukraine's political process?
Again, according to my research, Ukraine is not democracy after Maidan, because Maidan was undemocratic. Overthrow of Ukrainian government, it was violent and unconstitutional overthrow of Ukrainian government. Even though it was supported by Western democracies, this again, and was misrepresented by the media politicians, this was not democratic. And after Maidan massacre, with the election of new government, appointment of new government, which was immediately recognized by Western countries, so basically I call this, you can become a client state of the West, or United States in particular, but also other countries like United Kingdom, because the United States had a very strong influence over Ukrainian government, of a new government of Ukraine after Maidan. So they had involvement in appointments of like Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yatsenyuk, or Groisman, which was later appointed as Prime Minister of Ukraine, and removal of Yatsenyuk and Groisman, appointment of Prosecutor General of head of Ukraine, and kind of dismissal of him. This is, I think, this was admitted by Biden in his memoirs, his removal, kind of his request for kind of Poroshenko, president of Ukraine, to fire Shokin, who was head of Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine, and this is what happened. And there are also recordings of conversations between Biden and Poroshenko, in which they talk basically about appointments of Yatsenyuk and Groisman and removal of them later. So basically, Biden gave other minister of Ukraine, as I mentioned also, basically the general office of Ukraine had. So this is clear evidence that United States government was involved, heavily involved in determining kind of composition of Ukrainian government after the Maidan. And this is what kind of fits definition of Ukraine as client state. But also, this not only this, because Western governments, and in particular U.S. government, was also heavily involved in the key decisions of a new governments of Ukraine. In particular, according to testimonies and according to admissions by Maidan leaders, basically Biden and Obama. When Biden was vice president of U.S. under Obama, responsible for Ukrainian policy, and President Obama also told Ukrainian government after Maidan massacre that after also election of Maidan-led government not to use military force against Russia in Crimea. So this basically meant in order to avoid a war between Russia and Ukraine in 2014. And this meant basically that Western governments told Ukrainian government not to resist military to annexation of Crimea by Russia. This has happened. Actually, what happened? There was no fighting then between Ukrainian and Russian forces in Crimea. And Obama admitted this was done, that Russia annexed Crimea as basically as retaliation for Western supported overthrow of Ukrainian government during Maidan. But in addition to this, there is also testimony of eyewitnesses and that head of U.S. intelligence during his visit to Ukraine in April of 2014 gave permission or gave basic agreement of U.S. or encouraged kind of Ukrainian government led by Turchinov to use force against military force against separatists in Donbass. And this is how war in Donbass started with so-called anti-terrorist operation, which was announced by new government of Ukraine immediately after visit by head of U.S. intelligence. So this is also consistent with other evidence and shows that Ukraine basically was very closely kind of also dependent and also influenced by U.S. Politics and policy, in particular by kind of determining key decisions like Crimea, concerning Crimea and Donbass, and also composition of Ukrainian government, but also many other issues. You have a very strong involvement of the United States. So this means actually Ukraine become not an independent country, it became a client state, heavily dependent on the West after the Maidan. Even so, again, media did not report this with a few exceptions. And this is, again, an issue which is based on a variety of sources, which are, again, has nothing to do with Russia or Russian propaganda and so on, but kind of based on Ukrainian and Western sources, like all the examination of Maidan massacre. So this is, I think, very important issue and kind of consideration, because this also explains why Ukraine is used as a proxy war, why Ukraine basically is used as a proxy in a war between Russia and Ukraine. And this is all just another manifestation that Ukraine is not an independent country, a fully independent country, but sovereign country. It is kind of it is client state of the United States and was used as a proxy to contain Russia after Maidan, which was basically explained why Western countries supported Maidan, even so this was undemocratic. In particular, Maidan massacre, violent, again, kind of overthrow of Ukrainian government because they wanted to do this to contain Russia, Russian influence, and later they used Ukraine as a proxy to kind of fight Russia during the Russia-Ukraine war. So this means that, again, Ukrainian governments are not fully independent and they're heavily influenced by U.S. government and other Western governments. And this is also very important to understand the origins of Russia-Ukraine war and how Ukraine is used also as a proxy during this war, which again could not be won by Ukraine. And now we can see very tragic consequences of all these events taking place on Ukrainians, total devastation of Ukraine, and now very likely defeat of Ukraine as a result of this war. And this also would have very negative consequences for the West if, because again, the conflict which was started with Western-supported overthrow of Ukrainian government during the Maidan by means of the Maidan massacre.
Professor Katchanovski, I want to thank you for joining me today. This was such an interesting conversation. You spoke about so many interesting details that help understand not only what happened during the Maidan protests in 2014, but also what happens today, because that certainly set the stage. Our viewers will be able to find the open source link to your book in the video description below. Professor Katchanovski is also using crowdfunding to fund his research because he wants to make sure that people can read his books in the open access format. So if you would like to support Professor Katchanovski's research, please do so. I will also include the link to his crowdfunding site in the description below. Professor Katchanovski, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a great interview and a very kind of knowledgeable questions about this very important events. Thank you.